My name's Allyssa Bovasso-Pignataro, and I'm a community support intern for We Are Jersey magazine. And today I'm going to be speaking with Tomas Varela, the founder of the New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition, about this year's election, Project 2025, leadership, and much more. Welcome, Thomas. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. How are you doing?
Doing well, doing well. And yourself? Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Can you start off by telling me a little bit about yourself, why you do the work that you do, and the mission of the New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition?
Yeah, so I'm Tomas Varela. I am currently live in South Jersey. I am the executive director of the New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition. And what we do, we're a statewide nonprofit. We focus on civic education, voter education, and policy education rooted in racial justice. And so our focus as an organization is to ensure that all New Jerseyans, but particularly African Americans, understand the importance of civic participation and democracy. They understand the importance of certain policy issues and why these policy issues are important to their everyday life. And then finally, helping them understand the relationship between increased voting and policy change in their community. So we're really focused on trying to create more super voters in New Jersey so that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, the importance of voting in all elections and the implications of that.
So generally speaking, what qualities do you look for in a person to consider them to be a good leader?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of subjectivity to that. I know for me, I tend to be a humble person a bit, so I do like that quiet confidence. I'm not someone that resonates with a talker type. I do pay attention to results, um, and I don't always get motivated by someone who can like bring the fire and brimstone, or someone who can be very uh, 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 charismatic in that way. I think I really pay attention to your ability to convey the knowledge, your ability to make a compelling argument, and your ability to achieve results. I think that's something that's always important when you're doing this work is what's your track record of success? What's your track record of moving people in a direction that you would like? And also, it's important to keep in mind with track record of success, it doesn't necessarily need to be big wins, because in many cases the wins are not going to always be big, but just the fact that you're making progress is important, because at the end of the day, it's really critical that folks stay consistent with their work, stay consistent with their mission, and at the end of the day, be strategic and realistic with the wins, but then know that after you secure one win or after you secure one project completion, that you're ready to move on to the next project. So for me, it's really about people that have like a quiet confidence about them. They're humble enough to know that they're humble in their spirit, but they do have the confidence in their ability.
So some voters are not happy that the only two choices we have, once again, are President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. Some people I've talked to say that they're a little unsure about who they should vote for, and even if they'll go to the polls at all. Why is it important to exercise your right to vote, especially this year?
Yeah, it's important to vote, and honestly, it's important to vote in all elections, partly because it's our civic duty as Americans. Also, too, that's your way of speaking to the government. This country is a huge country with millions and millions of people, if not billions, and the government. There's certain systems in place that allow you, as a citizen, to communicate to your elected officials, your public servants, and voting is one of the ways to do that. So there's the civic duty and and that capacity, but then also particularly for communities that we work with, it's important to vote, because when communities talk about being ignored, part of the reason that they are ignored is because they're not voting their numbers. And so a perfect example, we have as society, we have a tendency to only vote in presidential elections, and we ignore your state and local elections. So then what you are doing when you by voting every 4 years, you're telling the campaigns, oh, this person only votes once every 4 years. So even though there's elections every year, we don't need to pay attention to them because they don't care about local elections. And the citizen may hear that and say, no, I do care. But the campaigns will say the proof is in the pudding. And thus, the proof is your voter turnout record. And so it becomes this disconnect and a little bit of a tug of war because we as a community will say, oh, it's the issue, the candidates that are there, I don't really like, so I'm not going to vote. Then the campaigns will look at the data and say, oh, Thomas didn't vote, so we're going to ignore him next time. And then I get frustrated and say, oh, they're not listening to me, I'm not going to vote again. And then the campaign says, oh, looks like Thomas didn't vote again, he doesn't care about what's going on. So then that's why campaigns, when they start to really strategize who they're going to target, they will focus on certain communities based on the track record of voting. And so that's why it's important to vote in all elections. It's also important to keep in mind that, yes, there's a little bit of a marketing exercise when we think about voting, right? One of the reasons why we vote mainly in presidential elections is because we get enough TV ads to remind us that this election is coming up. And so in this marketing exercise, we get the perception that it's Biden versus Trump or RFK and some of the other candidates, but it's honestly you're voting for the party. Yes, Biden and Trump are the top of their party, but ultimately you're voting for the party. Meaning, do you prefer Democratic administration and the policies that they champion overall? Do you support the potential people that a Democratic president will put in place to kind of lead the government, or do you support a Republican party and the potential people that Trump would put in office if he is the winner, right? So once again, we sometimes will get caught up in saying it's Trump versus Biden, and of course, like I said, some of the other not third party candidates, but it is administration versus administration. You are voting for the best Democrat, the best Republican, or the best Green Party, the best Libertarian, et cetera, et cetera. But because we know that historically the two presidential winners have either been Democrat or Republican, you are thus voting for the best Democrat or the best Republican.
So, what should those who are unsure about who to vote for do to become more informed about these candidates and feel a little more confident about their decision?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to do your research, right? I think it's important to kind of go to trusted resources. I know the internet is real easy for a lot of us to kind of decipher and just say, oh, I'll just go on Google, or I'll just go on TikTok to get my news. And yes, there are some solid trusted messengers there, but there are also people that are specifically on platforms like TikTok to target our community with misinformation. And so we have to be careful in those examples of knowing, okay, is this information actually truthful, or is it misinformation that's purposely trying to deflect? Now, that doesn't mean, and misinformation can be on both sides, right? So I know some of the data may perceive that it's one side or the other, but I think that's important because yes, you could have certain policy positions that that may be more inclined to be seen on one side of a platform versus another, but it's important to make the distinction between I have certain policy pillars that I care about versus this news article or this information that's being shared by some random website that's actually being controlled by a foreign agent with the sole purpose of distracting you. And so this is important, especially for African American communities and Latino communities, because these communities have been historically frustrated with government. They haven't seen, sometimes they don't see the success that they like, or they just feel frustrated not being heard. And so these foreign agents are targeting our community, like harnessing our frustration to encourage us not to participate. And so they basically want us to say, man, forget all this. I don't care about none of this. I'm not going to vote. And that's not good, of course, because we're not exercising our civic duty. We're not talking to our government, and we're not demonstrating our power. So I do want to kind of name that aspect in terms of being careful around misinformation versus trusted messengers. So, regardless if you're progressive or conservative, there are valid news sources that can give you some information. Also, the campaigns have platforms. You can go on their website and read or watch a video on the platforms. I know Biden has one, Trump has one, and some of the other candidates, they probably have one as well. And you can literally read their platform and read what they're saying, kind of digest what they're saying. Um, but ultimately, you want to think about, I would say, I know for me and the work that we do, we're trying to talk to people to recognize that there's a lot of issues that matter to our community more broadly. And so when you're trying to decide um, who you want to vote for, you have to think about one, what are the issues that you care about? And then two, what's the intensity of those issues? Because in order to kind of balance, okay, I care about this issue, but not that much. So maybe that's not a high priority. But this issue I care about a lot, and that can make the difference between me voting or not voting. So I'll give a perfect example. In 2020, there was a lot of language, and all the time you see a lot of language around, oh, people are going to vote based off the economy. That's going to be the deciding factor. But when you actually interview people, it was abortion that made a big difference in why they voted, right? So then what that meant was, yes, the economy was important, but abortion and the right to choose, that was that was more important. Like that, like it basically that became like a reason that people felt compelled to vote versus someone may say, yes, the economy is important, but that may not compel me to vote versus the right to choose. That was something that made people feel like they wanted to vote. So I think that's why it's important to kind of recognize that there are some competing, not want to say competing, but as a voter, you're trying to figure out, okay, I care about this, I care about this, I care about this. This issue I care about a little bit, this issue I care about medium, and you're kind of trying to like hit the right tune so that when you assess the candidates, you're trying to hopefully get as close of a match as possible, recognizing that it will never be 100% match. Like no candidate is perfect. Every candidate has flaws, but it's your job to hopefully be as aligned with the candidate and more importantly, the administration. It's simply not Biden Trump. It's administration versus administration or party versus party.
So both candidates had questionable performances in the first presidential debate, some saying they were acting like children. Trump was found to be lying in some of his responses, and Biden was not the sharpest at certain points. We've seen what they could both accomplish as presidents of the United States. So, what do both of their performances in the debate say about them as leaders?
Yeah, I think that's something that one could probably say, in some cases, this was just a moment, right? So I think President Biden would probably make the argument that this is just a moment. The debate is one instance of 90 minutes versus my 3.5 years as president, right? I know that's kind of the tagline that he tends to argue is that I've been president for 3.5 years. Look at that performance. I think sometimes they could make the argument that like the debate, yes, that's part of the process, but like typically administrations don't debate like this when you're in office, right? Like there's not no prime time, like US president versus China president prime minister at 8 p.m. on Fox News. Like that doesn't really happen. So this sense of debate, it's part of the process, but it may not be a true reflection of what the experience looks like. And then Trump may be able to say on his end that like I wasn't necessarily lying. This is my perspective as um as a president or as a candidate. This is what I believe, and you may call me a liar simply because you don't believe me. Right now, this is where, as citizens, we have to look past. We have to find those trusted messengers and those trusted platforms that do this work to be able to see, okay, how are they digesting what Trump said, what Biden said, and then in order to determine, okay, who's making the most sense. I think one of the things that is going to be good for the citizens is that we actually have a president versus former president. Typically, you don't have that, right? So, an example, when President Obama ran against Romney, President Obama had his track record. And I know that's maybe some years ago, your audience may be like, oh, I couldn't vote at that time. Let's just use that as an example. Typically, your president has a track record and the opponent doesn't have a track record because they never was president. So when that opponent is talking about what they're going to do, it's all hypothetical. You actually don't know what it will look like because they haven't done it before. Whereas in this case, President Biden has 3.5 years. Trump actually has 4 years because he was president. So now it actually creates a fairer fight, so to speak, to kind of look at, okay, how do I assess President Trump from 2016 and all the way to 2020, and technically to 2021 when his term was up, and then Biden for 3.5 years. So I think that's actually going to create a better assessment tool because they've both done it. They're not speaking hypothetical. So now we can reflect back on their their um their full experience as president and make an assessment as to like, okay, if they did this before, yes, they could switch, but maybe this is who they are as a president. This is their style. And so if we select them, they're going to be 4 more years of that style of a president.
So, how closely should we be looking at factors like age, mental quickness, and criminal convictions in comparison to the experience that each of them have?
Yeah, I think, every citizen, they can make the determination as to what matters to them. I do think all those things are important because you do want someone, like we said, like the debate, while that may not necessarily be how everyday um, operations exist as a president, but it is important that we're paying attention to their mental capacity um, to talk, to share what's happening, to be able to provide some insight as to how they are internalizing what's happening. I think obviously we're trying to be careful. It's important to kind of think about because there's could be concerns around ageism, but at the same time, it's hard to ignore what you see, right? So I think that's why it's really important that you're hearing from them more than once, right? So, once again, President Biden's probably going to make the argument, yes, you may have heard me at this one debate and you felt that I didn't perform in this moment, but in 3.5 years, I did this, I did this, I did this. Also, while in other forums and other um, places where I am on the campaign, you can hear me talk and you can hear that I know what I'm talking about. I know the issues. Yes, maybe I'm not talking as fast and et cetera, but um, this is where I stand. And then President Trump will probably say the same thing. I know a lot of his argument right now is, oh, yes, maybe I'm a convicted felon, but that's a lie. Or I was targeted, so they purposely wanted to get me to have a guilty record because they're targeting me or what have you. But I do think all of those issues are important, regardless of how they talk about it. It's important as we think about like to your earlier point, how do we define leadership? These individuals, yes, it's Democratic administration versus Republican administration, but whoever is the winner is the representative of the United States in the world, right? So then we have to ask ourselves, how do we want to be presented in the world? And our president is supposed to be that representation. And so you have to then ask those things regarding um, how they present, how knowledgeable they are on the issues, how knowledgeable they are in terms of relationship building with foreign countries, how knowledgeable they are in terms of um, pu- pushing pushing an idea or an agenda that they believe is in the best interest of the United States and its allies. And so, those are all the things that these candidates have to think about. And I think for us as citizens, we have to think about all of those aspects. Like, how do we think about that leader and how they're going to present us and represent us on the world stage? And so all those things can matter. And I know sometimes many times in politics, people will dismiss a lot of things because it's really about power, right? So they will say, yeah, Trump has a criminal record, but we'll justify it because we want X, Y, and Z. Or Biden is too old. We'll justify it because we want power and we want to maintain power. So, I think um, we as citizens, it can feel tempting to fall victim to that. But I think it's really important that we are staying true about how we think about what matters to us and identify the candidates that reflect that.
Many politicians, including Democrats, said they think that Biden should step down and allow Vice President Kamala Harris to run in his place. If he were to step down, could this help or hurt the Democratic Party's chances of winning the election?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I will want to be careful. As a nonprofit, I don't want to necessarily put any type of sway there. But I would imagine, like just reading reading some of the reporting that exists, I think there is the perception that if Biden is too old for the role, that VP Harris would be able to do the job. Um, in that regard, I think she's totally able to do the job as a Black woman. I think she's more than qualified in that regard. But I think there is this feeling of, okay, on the one hand, will she be able to withstand some of the racism or gender sexism or racism that may be conveyed on her? You know, I know that some may say, no, we have policy differences and it isn't necessarily racism or sexism that animates why we're against her. I think for some that make the argument that VP Harris would be better because she's younger, she's able to convey a different message, she's able to present herself differently. Maybe that will matter to the people who feel that Biden is too old. So I think it really just depends. I think both, there will definitely be a lot of upheaval a bit just because you don't typically have a president that will leave like during the campaign. In terms of if it's good or bad, I leave it up to the pundits to kind of make that determination. You know what I mean? I think obviously there's a lot of risk. And from what I've seen and read, there's a positive, there's risk and reward with that decision. But I think there's also risk and reward with keeping Biden because Biden does have a track record. So he can say, hey, the reason that I won is because of in 2020 was because of these audiences. And those individuals still want me to be president, especially because here's my track record that they believe is successful. Disrupting that will cause too much harm. So I think I think it is a difficult conversation that the party kind of has to wrestle with. And there's probably a lot of risk on both sides, but ultimately they're going to have to think about what's in the best interest for their party.
Plans for Project 2025 have been going around on social media recently, and there seems to be a lot of information swirling around about the specifics of it. Could you just tell us a little bit about what Project 2025 is for those who aren't familiar?
Yeah. There's a lot of news, a lot of noise. So I think that's why it's important to kind of have this conversation. So Project 2025, it's titled the Presidential Transition Project. It comes from an organization called Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation is a think tank. And so conservatives and progressives have think tanks. Think tanks are essentially organizations that do a lot of research to try to give recommendations to the legislators, the lawmakers, as to what policy should be implemented. So, as you can imagine, um, if you're a Democrat, you might be dealing with a progressive think tank or a moderate think tank, and they're giving you recommendations as to this is these are the policies that you should pursue, or these are the legislation that you should pursue because of the best interest of the agenda that we're trying to set. And so on the conservative side, the Heritage Foundation is one, and there's a lot of others out there that are basically given a recommendation to, in this example, President Trump, if he is to win, here's a roadmap as to how you should shape your government um, to enact an agenda that we believe is important. So this goes back to once again why we talk about it's not Biden versus Trump, it's administration versus administration. And so in this Project 25 example, they provide a full, as they said, it's almost 1,000 pages. Like every single department, this is how you should shape the department. This is how you should design, certain administrations, protocols, policies, um, and there are other aspects to Project 25 as well. They're creating a database. So let's say I'm someone that is conservative and I want a way to maybe join the administration. I can submit my resume in their database so that I can be discovered to potentially work for the administration. So it is not just like it's this policy project, but they also have this database. They also provide a roadmap, like a 180-day roadmap that says in 180 days, whoever adopts our campaign, and if it's Trump, we believe that Trump should achieve this, this, and this in the first 180 days. Now, to be clear, Trump has identified himself as not being attached to Project 2025, and that is technically true. But I know there is data that, and so this is where it can be tricky for individuals because, yes, he may not be attached to it, um, and that's important to kind of keep that context. But think tanks are designed to try to influence legislation and influence presidents. So there's, so the expectation, the assumption would be, let me say, the assumption would be that if President Trump was to win, that he would be given this roadmap. Like basically, they would say, "Here's your 900-page book. Hopefully, you follow all of it, or hopefully, you follow some of it." Um, I know that there were people that worked in his administration in 2016 that helped to shape this roadmap. So once again, I think that's the give and take. I guess that's the battle. I don't want to say battle. I'm trying to think of the right word. Like that's the assessment that citizens have to take, right? On the one hand, Trump is saying, "No, that's not my plan. I have my own plan. It's called Agenda 47. That's what you should research." There are others that are like, "No, yes, that's technically true, but half your administration helped develop Project 2025. So, thus, while you may say it's not yours, we believe you're going to adopt it if you win because a lot of your previous people are there." So I think that's the conversation that people are wrestling with, where conservatives are making the argument, no, that's not mine. Agenda 47 is my plan. And then progressives and Democrats are saying, no, you might say that, but we know the implications. And I think that's why people have to kind of, do their research and understand first. They have to ask themselves, okay, there are some folks that agree with Project 2025, right? They agree with certain policy pillars that exist in there, and that's their right to do so. And there are others that feel like, no, this is kind of scary. We don't like some of the things that they talked about in Project 2025. Like I know there's one that feels like, oh, you have to pledge allegiance to the president, meaning that most public government workers, regardless if they're Democrat or Republican, they're hired to just do the job. And so the assumption that is made is that if president was to win and he adopts this Project 25, he would basically go to all the civil service people and say, "You're fired unless you show complete support to me." And so there's a lot of people that feel that that's scary because it's like, no, my job, I'm a civil service. Yes, I may be conservative, but I'm just doing my job. I should not say that I'm allegiant to Trump just to do my job as a government official. And that's the same for someone who's a Democrat. So I think that's an example of one that a lot of people have kind of focused on as a little bit scary. But like I said, there's some people like around Medicare that people don't like Medicare, and thus they want that to be dissolved. And that's one of the things that's listed in Project 25. So, once again, that's important for people to do their research and make the determination as to what makes sense. But at the end of the day, it is an example of how um, think tanks and policy platforms and others are able to influence potentially who is president. And that's why we as American citizens have to understand what's being said and do our own research to find the right information based on our trusted messengers, and then recognize it's administration versus administration. It's not simply Biden versus Trump.
Going back to what you said about the allegiance part, I think that's part of the applications that they have on the Project 2025 website, right? They
Yeah,
ask a question if you're loyal to Donald Trump. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's the perception. Yeah, that's one of the things I know a lot of people have kind of brought up in the news is that that's one of the expectations that um, if Trump was to win, he would him and his administration would go to the executive branch and the government and basically ask people to make that pledge, so to speak.
What other parts of this plan caught your attention?
Yeah, so I think for me, when I think about the work that we're doing, we're thinking about individuals need access to Medicare, so that's really important. It's proposed that they will eliminate Head Start, which is really important for Black and Brown communities that leverage Head Start early education programs. They talked about access to food assistance once again for a lot of African Americans who are under poverty, dealing with poverty. Having access to food assistance is important. Um, Once again, and I think it's important to keep in mind that with Project 25, yes, it's getting a lot of attention now, but it's part of this vision of like how we want government to function has been out there in years past, right? When President Trump was before, you would hear legislators talk about, oh, we want to get rid of Medicare. Like that's not something that's like just happened yesterday. Like that's been things that they've always kind of championed. I think because it's been packaged in this nice 900-page document, that's what's getting a lot of attention. But conservatives have always had this mindset of these kind of policy pillars. So, once again, for Black and Brown folks and the folks that we work with, we are thinking about public servants that recognize the importance of Head Start, that recognize the importance of the American Rescue Plan, recognize the importance of Medicare, because those are things that do matter to our community. So, I think those are things that we're monitoring and we're always going to try to think about in terms of issues. But at the end of the day, it is a policy plan, and as mentioned, if Trump is president, he's not is not required that he has to adopt this, right? At the end of the day, he's president. He gets to determine what policies he believes are going to be important for the American people. But this is just a guide that that people believe he will adopt.
I think that's I think what's scaring people or making people a little alarmed is because this is from the Heritage Foundation. They said that Trump, I think he used or took 64% of the policy prescriptions in his budget. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I think it
Yeah,
was
I don't know the exact number, but that's essentially like I think the argument being made was when he was president in 2016, um, he he was given some of these plans because once again, these are not new ideas, so to speak. And so the assumption was, or not even the assumption, there's probably data that can show. And if Heritage Foundation is making the argument, they're probably saying, hey, Trump embraced a lot of what we proposed in 2016. There were people that was on his administration that worked for us in the past, or we gave them recommendations. And so I'm not sure the exact number, but if Heritage Foundation is saying, hey, in the past, he's embraced a lot of what we've talked about, I think that's why a lot of people are kind of like, hey, you've already leveraged this in the past, so there's a greater likelihood that you're going to embrace Project 2025, if all of it or at least some of it. And so I think that's kind of what people are, especially those that are Democrats or those that are progressive, that's kind of the argument that they're making that, oh, you've already embraced some of it. So why am I to believe that you're not going to do that again? And once again, that's the role of think tanks, both progressive and conservatives, is to basically give recommendations for the legislators and the lawmakers to figure out how to design their government and how to function their government. Because a lot of these lawmakers, they don't always have the expertise or the time to actually write the policies themselves. They basically receive recommendations from these think tanks, and these think tanks help them shape the policies and go from there.
So last Saturday at Trump's campaign rally in Pennsylvania, a man attempted to assassinate him at the podium, but ended up killing one person and injuring, I think, two other people. What was your initial reaction when you heard about the incident?
Well, I'll be honest. At first, I thought it was just shock at first because it's just kind of wrapping your head around like someone really tried to kill Trump. Like, I think, in this moment, like political violence is not good and it's not something that we should desire. So I think there was that initial shock. And of course, there is that sadness, like literally someone died. This person is a hero. The fact that there's reports that the person was literally protecting his family and took a bullet. I think that's disappointing. It's very sad that that has happened. So, my thoughts are to the family in that regard. So I think, it's one of those things where it's like there is the sense of disbelief at first because it's like, wow, like this is where we're at in society that we're literally trying to assassinate people. Like I don't think that should, like, at the end of the day we recognize that like government is important, and picking the right, picking the administration that's best for you as as a citizen is important, but it should not get to the point that people feel like you have to kill someone in order to quote unquote win, or in order to um like we should not get to the point that folks are like where violence is being considered in these environments. And so I think it's something that it's unfortunate. And and I know there's a lot of noise out there in terms of um was this planned or was it not planned? I think it's probably premature to kind of think like that, but it's important to just follow the listen to the once again follow the trusted messengers, um, read the news, and yes, we have our own gut feeling, right? As in, like we all have our gut feelings as to what we think happens and things like that. But that's why it's really important that we think about making sure that we're getting news from the right places and we're allowing the investigations to do the work so that we are not just spouting off. Like we all have our own opinions and we're entitled to have our own opinions, but we also have to be mindful that we should allow facts to kind of guide us.
Do you think that this will have an effect on the election this year?
Um, I imagine it can, but I think one of the things that we're seeing in news reports is like, once again, both of these people have been president. Most people, um, there's not, one of the things they talk about is like the swing voter, the person that's quote unquote undecided. One, a lot of those people that say they're undecided kind of already are decided. Sometimes they like to say they're undecided because it makes them feel like, oh, I'm not swayed easily or what have you. So there's that, right? But then two, um, a lot of folks already have an opinion of Biden and Trump. So someone who is gonna vote, like, I don't anticipate that there's gonna be a lot of people that were like, oh, I'm undecided, and so I'm gonna go to Trump because of him being shot, or I'm undecided and I'm going to go to Biden because I think Trump staged this or whatever, right? I don't think those are things that I think those are there are people that kind of already were going to go to Biden and Trump anyways, right? And I think so. I think in previous years that could have had a difference, but I think in this election, so many people know Biden and Trump that I don't think a lot of people are going to be swayed because I think people already are leaning towards one or the other, and they're just looking for confirmation bias.
And after the incident, Biden called for unity of the American people. How important is it for people to come together despite their beliefs at a time like this?
Oh no, it's critical. Once again, what we talked about earlier, right? Yes, there's a difference between your own policy beliefs and someone else. I think that's why it's important to be a participant in democracy, because democracy is that tug of war between like, this is what I want, this is what you want, and how do we come to a compromise, right? And I think that's a perfect example. Like beyond um president, as community, we may be idealistic and say we want X, Y, and Z. These are the five policy pillars. Or let's say 10. These are the 10 policy pillars, no questions asked. These are only things I care about. We share them with the elected officials. The elected officials hear from us and they're gonna try their best to help, enact all 10 policy pillars. But there's another party in some instances. So that other party is hearing from their own constituents. And their own constituents are telling them, okay, we care about 1 through 10, but someone else cares about 11 through 20. And so now you have competing factors where, okay, we have to figure out what's the give and take in order to determine what's the policies that is the most beneficial to the most people based on party. because politics is the art of compromise. And I think that can always be tough for citizens to recognize because we think we don't want to compromise. We want all 10 policies. But politics is the art of compromise. But that's also why parties want to have like all three branches of, I mean, like all two branches, right? Well, three, meaning they typically they want the House, they want the Senate, and they want the presidency because it makes it easier to pass legislation. Because if you are in all three, then whatever the House passes, typically the Senate will pass because they're in the majority, and then the president will sign it. So in this example, President Biden, um, he would like for the House to be Democrats, um, and the Senate as well. Like in this current climate, perfect example, the House right now is led by Republicans. So since they have the majority, there is a greater likelihood that their policies they're going to propose, there's going to be some changes because the Senate is majority Democrat. So they're going to take this proposal and probably insert their own recommendations, or they're just going to not pass it because they're in total disagreement. So that's a perfect example of how you try to compromise. The House will probably say, okay, we really want this to pass, so we may need to include some things that Democrat will like so that when it goes to the Senate, maybe they will pass it. And so then some of our things get passed, some of their things get passed, and then the president signs it. Not everyone wins, but that's the art of legislation, the art of compromise.
Okay. Those are all the questions that I have. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude?
Yeah, no, I think once again, it's just really important to vote. One of the things we talk about a lot is that elected officials, they don't listen to people, they listen to voters because voters determine if an elected official wins or loses a race, not people, right? And so that's important for communities like that we speak to a lot, is because once again, we have a healthy frustration with government because we feel that we haven't seen certain progress. But being apathetic is not the answer because that actually keeps the system rolling. And so it's really important to kind of overwhelm the system because by overwhelming the system, you're forcing the government to respond to your needs, right? And of course, yes, we might be thinking, no one's called me, so they don't know what my needs are, right? But you kind of share your needs through the people that you vote for. They're supposed to be a representation of you, right? We're 330 billion people. The President Biden is not calling each of us individually, but by voting for the right representatives, that representative is hopefully going to be a representation of my needs, and so that's why we vote, so that hopefully they will push policies that will then circle back and reflect our needs. But then more importantly is that fact that at the end of the day, politicians, they care about winning, and they win or lose a race based on voters. You can complain all you want, but if you don't vote, then you can't determine if a person wins or loses. And so that's why it's really important to understand there is a distinction between being a person and being a voter. And our hope is that everyone becomes a voter. Oh, and if I would suggest, follow us across social media. You can find us on Instagram, NJBEC underscore. You can find us on Twitter. All of our platforms, primarily NJBEC. You'll see different events that we have. We have a video database, video library of all types of policy conversations, civic conversations, and webinars to help you understand government and policy a bit more. So follow us across social media and share it with your friends.
It was a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Thank you for having me. Appreciate the opportunity. Really appreciate the work that We Are Jersey is doing, and we're excited to continue to follow and support them.